December 1864. Union cavalry are riding hard into the mountains of southwestern Virginia, and their target isn't a fort, a railroad, or a general. It's a pile of iron kettles. In the town of Saltville, those kettles boil brine into salt, and salt is the only thing keeping the Confederate Army's meat from rotting off the bone before it reaches a single soldier. Burn the salt works, and you starve an army without ever firing on it. Men fought and bled and died over that ground, over a mineral you'll spill on your kitchen counter tonight and not even bother to wipe up. This is where it begins. To understand why Americans were killing each other over salt kettles in 1864, you have to leave America completely. You have to go back about 8,000 years to a cold spring bubbling up out of the ground in what's now the subcarpathian hills of Romania. There's no country there yet, no writing, no wheel, just a handful of Neolithic people who noticed that the water from this one spring left a white crust behind when it dried on a rock. They started hauling that water to their fires and boiling it down in clay pots, hour after hour, until nothing was left but a gritty grey mineral at the bottom. Archaeologists have dated that operation to around 6,000 BC. People were making salt on purpose roughly 7,700 years before the United States existed as a country. Sit with that for a second. When those men and women were crouched over their fires scraping salt out of cracked clay, the pyramids were still 3,000 years from being built. And here's the part nobody tells you. The moment those people figured out salt, their population started to climb. That's not a coincidence. Because salt isn't a seasoning. Not really. Your body runs on it. Every heartbeat, every nerve signal, every muscle you move depends on sodium shuttling in and out of your cells. Lose too much of it, and you cramp, you seize, you die. A human being can no more skip salt than skip water. And unlike a deer or your dog, you can't just find it lying around most places on Earth. You have to go get it, dig it, boil it, trade for it. Then there's the other thing salt does, the thing that rewrote history. Before refrigerators, before your Frigidaire, before the Costco freezer aisle, salt was the only reliable way to keep meat and fish from turning to poison. Rub enough salt into a slab of pork and you can eat it 6 months later in the dead of winter, when nothing is growing and nothing is alive to hunt. Salt was the pause button on death itself. A people who controlled salt controlled who ate through the winter. A people who didn't last the winter. The first civilizations to turn salt from survival into a business were the ones who realized everybody needed it and almost nobody could make it. The Romans understood this better than anyone. They built an entire road, the Via Salaria, literally the salt road, running from the salt pans on the coast up into the capital just to move the stuff. Think about that. Rome, the empire that gave us concrete and aqueducts and highways that engineers still study, decided one of its flagship roads existed to haul a mineral. You've probably heard the famous story that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, and that's where we get the word salary. It's a great story. It's in 100 textbooks. And historians will tell you it's almost certainly not true. Roman soldiers were paid in coins, like everybody else. The word salary does trace back to the Latin salarium, which is tied to the Latin word for salt. But there's no solid evidence anyone ever got handed a sack of salt as a paycheck. That paid in salt version seems to have been invented by dictionary writers in the 1700s and 1800s, who were guessing at the connection and filled the gap with a good yarn. But look at what the myth gets right. Even by accident, salt was so bound up with money, with worth, with staying alive, that an entire empire wove its word for pay around it and built a highway to carry it. When something ends up buried that deep in your language, you don't need the legend to be literally true to understand the point. That obsession was about to go global, because a few thousand miles south, in a place most Americans have never heard of, salt wasn't being compared to gold. It was being traded for it, ounce for ounce. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between. I always want to know. Picture a town where the houses are made of salt. Not decorated with salt. Made of it. The walls, the rooftops, the mosque, all cut from slabs of grey rock salt, hauled straight out of the ground. Because in the middle of the Sahara, there is nothing else to build with. No trees, no timber, no stone. Just sand and salt and heat that would kill you by noon. That town was real. It was called Tagaza. And in the 1300s, a traveller named Ibn Battuta actually went there and wrote it down. Houses of salt, roofed with camel skin. Nobody living there but the enslaved men who dug the salt out of the earth. Here's why anyone bothered to mine salt in one of the worst places on earth. Down in West Africa, in the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, there was gold. Mountains of it. What there wasn't was salt. People farming and working through brutal tropical heat need salt to survive, and the West African interior had almost none of its own. So the two things nobody could live without met in the middle of the desert. Gold coming up from the south, salt coming down from the Sahara, and they traded them against each other, sometimes close to ounce for ounce. A slab of salt could be worth a slab of gold. Whoever controlled the salt controlled the gold. Whoever controlled the gold controlled everything. This is how you get Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, still called, 700 years later, quite possibly the richest human being who ever lived. Wealthier by some estimates than anyone on today's Forbes list. His fortune didn't fall out of the sky. It came from taxing that trade. The gold going out, the salt coming in, his treasury clipping a piece off every caravan. A single desert crossing could carry a fortune worth more than the entire annual budget of a small American city. And Timbuktu, the place Americans use as a punchline for the middle of nowhere, was, in its day, one of the richest and most learned cities on the planet, built on the Salt and Gold Road. It wasn't only Africa. On the other side of the world, Chinese dynasties ran one of the oldest government salt monopolies in history. The state seized control of every grain of it, taxed it, and used the money to pay armies and build walls. In Europe, Venice made itself a superpower doing the same thing with Mediterranean salt. The pattern kept repeating on every continent because the logic never changed. Tax the one thing nobody is allowed to refuse to buy. Quick thing before we get to the dark part of this story. If you're the kind of person who likes seeing the machinery under the world pulled out into the light, subscribe. That's the whole channel, right there, okay? Because that salt had to come from somewhere, and somebody had to dig it. Every empire that got rich off salt eventually got greedy with it. And that is exactly where salt earns the title of a mineral that brought empires down. Take France. For centuries, the French crown ran a salt tax called the gabelle, and it became one of the most hated taxes in European history. It wasn't just that salt was taxed, it was rigged and cruel. The price swung wildly depending on which province you were born in. And across much of the country, every person over the age of 8 was forced by law to buy a fixed amount of salt every year, at the government's price, whether they needed it or not. Smuggling salt to dodge it could send you to prison or to the galleys. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the gabelle had spent generations teaching ordinary French people to despise their own government. Salt was one of the grievances that helped light the fuse. And when the revolutionaries came for the old order, the salt tax was one of the first things they tore down. Now jump halfway around the world, 2 centuries later. In 1930, the British Empire controlled India, and one of the ways it controlled India was salt. The British made it a crime for Indians, living on a subcontinent ringed by ocean and crusted with salt, to make their own. You had to buy British salt, and you had to pay the British tax on it. So a 61-year-old man named Gandhi decided to break that law in the most public way he could imagine. He walked 240 miles, over 24 days, from his home to the sea, gathering crowds the entire way while the world's newspapers followed every step. And when he reached the water, bent down and picked a lump of natural salt up off the beach, that was the crime. That one small act of making salt set off a wave of civil disobedience that swept up tens of thousands of arrests and stripped the moral authority right off the most powerful empire on earth. Salt didn't just embarrass the British, it helped end their grip on India. Sit with what that means. The same white stuff in the shaker on your table has, more than once, been the thing ordinary people picked up and used to break the most powerful governments in the world. Because the moment a ruler tries to own salt, they've picked a fight with every single body that needs it to live. Go back to that salt in the desert and ask the question the empires never wanted anyone to ask. Who dug it? At Tagaza, the answer was enslaved men, dropped in a place with no fresh water and no food that didn't have to be carried in across weeks of open desert, hacking slabs of salt out of the ground under a sun that regularly broke 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They didn't own the salt. They never saw the gold. They lived in houses built of salt, in a pit made of salt, and they dug until they couldn't dig anymore. And Tagaza was not the exception. Everywhere salt got made, somebody paid for it with their body. Boiling brine meant standing over roaring fires through endless shifts in choking heat and steam. Skin slick, lungs raw. Mining rock salt meant going down into the dark and breathing salt dust that dried you out from the inside. The work wrecked hands and backs and eyes and lungs. There's no clean ledger for how many died making the world's salt. No neat number carved on a monument. But the pattern is unmistakable, across every continent and every century. The people who dug it and boiled it were treated as disposable, used up and swapped out, because the salt was always worth more than they were. It's the same cold arithmetic you're going to hear again before this is over. Quick question, and I actually want your answer down in the comments. How much salt do you think the average American goes through in a single year? Every chip, every slice of bread, every drive-through order, all of it added up. Take a real guess right now before I tell you. We'll come back to it. Because this is where the story turns toward home. The country you're sitting in was shaped by salt just as hard as any empire in the desert. When the founding fathers were still arguing over the Constitution, colonists in upstate New York were already boiling salt out of brine springs beside a lake called Onondaga. That spot grew into Syracuse, New York. And for most of the 1800s, Americans called it the Salt City. It made so much salt that the state slapped a tax on every bushel and funneled the money into one of the most important construction projects in American history, the Erie Canal. The waterway that cracked open the Midwest, turned New York into the country's biggest city, and rerouted the entire American economy. People at the time flat out called it the ditch that salt built. By the middle of the century, Syracuse was pushing out more than 12 million bushels of salt a year, and the Onondaga salt operation kicked over $2 million toward the canal. Salt didn't just flavor early America, it helped pay for it. Which brings us right back to those Union cavalrymen in the Virginia mountains. Now you know why they were there. In the Civil War, salt was a weapon. The South couldn't make enough of it, and without salt, you cannot preserve the meat that feeds an army on the march. So the Union went hunting Confederate salt works the way a modern military would go after an oil refinery. Saltville, Virginia, held some of the biggest kettles in the Confederacy, and men fought 2 separate battles over that ground. Because whoever ran out of salt first ran out of army first. A pinch of the stuff you shake onto your fries was, for 4 straight years, a matter of national survival. After the war, salt got industrialized and cheap. So cheap, it stopped feeling valuable at all. In 1914, an American company named Morton put salt in a round blue container with a little girl and an umbrella, and the slogan, "When it rains, it pours." And salt finished its long fall from precious to forgettable, sitting on every kitchen table in the country. Then salt did something almost nobody remembers. It quietly saved millions of American brains. In the early 1900s, huge stretches of this country, the Great Lakes, Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, sat on iodine-poor soil. People there developed goiters, grotesque swellings of the thyroid, and something far worse than a lump on the neck. Iodine deficiency during pregnancy could permanently lower a child's IQ. In parts of the goiter belt, it struck up to 70% of kids. During World War I, One Michigan draft board had to turn away nearly a third of its young men over thyroid problems. So in 1924, starting in Michigan, salt makers began stirring a trace of iodine into table salt. Morton took it national. Within a couple of decades, goiter among Michigan schoolchildren collapsed from nearly 40% to barely 1%. It was one of the most effective public health moves in American history, and it happened inside the salt shaker. But here's the detail that matters for everything coming next. When the country looked at making iodized salt mandatory, actually requiring it by law, that effort failed. A 1948 push to mandate it died. Adding iodine stayed voluntary. The companies had done the right thing on their own, and it worked, so nobody forced the issue. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not, because it set the template for how America would handle salt from then on. We asked the food industry nicely, and we let them decide, and that worked out just fine, back when the thing being added to your salt was saving your life. What I haven't told you yet is what happens when the industry's incentive flips, when the stuff loaded into your food is quietly making you sick, and voluntary is still the only rule on the books. The people selling you salt right now already know exactly what it's doing. They've known for decades. Here's the thing about salt today. You are almost certainly eating far too much of it, and it is almost certainly not your fault. The average American takes in about 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day. The recommended ceiling is 2,300, roughly 1 teaspoon. So we are running about 50% over that line every single day for a lifetime. And when your blood pressure climbs, and it does, that is the freight that arrives decades later as heart attacks and strokes. Now, here's the part that should genuinely make you angry. You picture the salt problem as that shaker on your table, right? The one you're always told to put down? Throwing out your salt shaker would barely move the needle, because more than 70% of the sodium Americans eat was already in the food before it ever reached your kitchen, poured in by manufacturers and restaurants. It's in bread that doesn't even taste salty. It's in your breakfast cereal. It's in the pasta sauce, the deli turkey, the rotisserie chicken, the healthy frozen dinner. The salt you control is a rounding error. The salt you don't control is the whole game. Why do they load it in? Because salt is one of the cheapest substances on Earth. Rock salt runs around $50 a ton, and it does a lot of quiet work for a food company. It makes cheap, bland ingredients taste rich. It masks the staleness in older product and stretches shelf life. It makes you thirsty and keeps you reaching for more. For pennies, salt makes mediocre food sell. That's the math. Nobody had to write it down in a memo. The incentive does the writing. And your government, it knows all of it. The FDA has said out loud in its own official guidance that more than 70% of America's sodium comes from processed and restaurant food. So what did the FDA actually do about it? It asked nicely. In 2016, the FDA proposed sodium targets for the food industry, goals to gently walk that 3,400 number down over time, targets that were, and still are, completely voluntary. Not a limit, not a law, a suggestion. The food industry pushed back, and the guidance got delayed for years across multiple administrations before a first watered-down version was finally finalized in 2021, aiming to nudge the average from 3,400 down to 3,000. A second round proposed in 2024 reaches for 2,750, still comfortably above the 2,300 that health experts actually recommend. Remember that small decision back in 1924, the one where America decided salt fortification would be voluntary, the industry's call? This is where it detonates. Same country, same rulebook, opposite outcome. When voluntary meant adding iodine, it saved kids. Now that voluntary means removing salt that sells product, the needle barely twitches. The FDA knows, the USDA knows, Congress knows, and the rule is still, pretty please. So how does a system like this protect itself? Not with some dramatic movie conspiracy, with something quieter and honestly more effective. It makes sure the rules never have teeth. Keep every target voluntary. Fight the timelines. Fund the lobbying. Frame the whole thing as freedom. Nobody's coming for your salt shaker, while the actual sodium, the 70% you never chose, stays right where it is, because that is what moves product. And the bill is staggering. Nearly half of American adults, around 48%, about 120 million people, have high blood pressure. That is more people than live in the entire states of California, Texas, and Florida combined. In 2024 alone, high blood pressure was a primary or contributing cause of more than 680,000 American deaths. And the cost of it, the doctor visits, the medication, the hospital stays, the lost work, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. You pay for that, in your premiums, in your taxes, and in the people you love. Salt isn't the only thing that drives blood pressure up, but decades of research put it near the center of the problem, and the single biggest lever we could actually pull, cutting the salt that industry pours into food, is the one lever the government has refused to pull hard. The sliver of good news. This is finally getting dragged into the light. Doctors, researchers, and public health groups have spent years hammering on these numbers, and the FDA's own reports now say the quiet part in print, that the salt is coming from the manufacturers, not from your shaker. The information is public. It's the will that's missing. So here's the honest, quiet, devastating version of it. Nobody is hiding a body. The data has been sitting in plain sight in government documents for years. Half the adults in this country have high blood pressure. Most of the salt driving it was put there by somebody else, and the strongest rule on the books is a polite request. They know. They've known the whole time. And Americans keep paying the price, one heartbeat at a time. Step back and look at where salt actually lives in your life right now, and it gets strange. The United States produces around 40 million tons of salt a year. A $2.5 billion industry, dug and boiled and evaporated across Kansas, Louisiana, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Texas, and Utah. But here's the twist almost nobody knows. Most American salt never touches food at all. The single biggest use is dumping it on winter roads to melt ice. Tens of millions of tons a year crunching under your tires every time it snows. Nearly as much goes to the chemical industry, where salt gets torn apart to make the chlorine that disinfects your tap water and the compounds that become the PVC pipe inside your walls. The salt you actually eat is a thin slice of that mountain, and the brands are all around you. Morton, with the same little girl and umbrella from 1914, sitting on the shelf at Walmart and Kroger. Cargill, one of the biggest private companies in America, moving salt by the trainload. American rock salt, hauling it out of the ground under New York State. Oh, and that guess I asked you for, back in the desert. The average American eats somewhere around 7 pounds of salt a year, roughly the weight of a newborn baby, swallowed one shake at a time. And most of it, you never poured. Put the rest of it where you'll actually run into it in the next 24 hours. It's the crust on the pretzel. It's the reason the fast food fries taste like that. It's baked into the bread you'll build a sandwich out of, whether you reach for the shaker or not. It's the grit on the road on your commute. It's dissolved in the glass of tap water sitting next to you right now, because the chemical that made that water safe to drink started its life as salt. You will touch salt today in more ways than you can count. You just won't see most of them. So here's what salt actually is, once you can see the whole thing at once. It's the mineral people learned to make before they learned to write. It built towns out of salt bricks in the Sahara and made Timbuktu rich. It funded the canal that opened up America and starved the army that tried to tear America in half. It walked to the sea with Gandhi and helped break an empire. And today, it sits in a blue container on a shelf at Costco for about $1. So cheap and so ordinary, we treat it as nothing at all. That's the whole trick of it. The most valuable things eventually turn invisible. Salt fell all the way from worth its weight in gold to beneath your notice. And somewhere in that fall from precious to invisible is exactly where the modern problem learned to hide. You stopped watching salt, so you never noticed that most of the salt in your life is a choice somebody else made for you. The 70% poured into your food, the target the FDA won't enforce, the blood pressure creeping up in half the adults you know. America likes to believe it runs on free choice and open information. Salt is a quiet little test of that belief. The most important decisions about the salt in your own body, how much, from where, whether anyone's even allowed to load it in without telling you, were never actually yours to make. So, let me leave you with one thing to sit with. How many other things in your life right now, in your fridge, in your medicine cabinet, in your bloodstream, got there because of a decision made in a boardroom you'll never see, by people you'll never meet, that you never got to vote on? Sit with that one, and then do something with it. Tell me in the comments, what's something you eat every single day that you now realize you never really chose? I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the true history hiding inside the ordinary stuff of your life, subscribe. Hit the like button. It's a small thing, but it tells me to keep digging like this, and share this with the one person in your life who's absolutely sure they already know how the world works. Because the next time you're at dinner and you reach for the salt, that little reflex, the pinch, the shake you don't even think about, remember what you're actually touching. The one mineral empires were built on, wars were fought over, and revolutions were sparked to control. Kings hoarded it. Enslaved men died digging it. Gandhi walked to the ocean for it, and it ended up here, on your table, in your bread, in your blood. So cheap, you'll spill some tonight and never bother to wipe it up. That's not nothing. It was never nothing. And now you'll never be able to untaste it.